What happens when daytime television's most beloved host meets Hollywood royalty turned real royalty in a collision that nobody saw coming? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Lorraine Kelly for what was supposed to be a light-hearted morning chat that quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on live television. The Duchess of Sussex arrived at the ITV studios, expecting the usual softball questions and warm reception that Lorraine is famous for. But what transpired instead was a masterclass in how quickly things can go wrong when egos clash and carefully constructed public personas begin to crumble under pressure. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two of the most talked about women in British media go head-to-head in a battle that had viewers across the nation reaching for their remote controls, not to change the channel, but to turn up the volume. The morning started like any other on the Lorraine show. The familiar orange and blue set was perfectly lit, the cameras were rolling, and Lorraine Kelly herself was sitting in her signature spot, radiating that warm Scottish charm that has made her a household name for decades. The production team had been buzzing with excitement for weeks about landing this particular interview. Getting Meghan Markle to appear on British television was considered something of a coup, especially given the complicated relationship between the Duchess and the British media following her and Prince Harry's departure from royal duties. Meghan swept onto the set wearing an elegant cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her signature megawatt smile firmly in place. She settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who had done countless interviews, crossing her legs and adjusting her posture with the kind of calculated precision that comes from years of media training. The audience in the studio gave her a warm welcome, and for those first few moments, everything seemed perfectly choreographed for another successful Lorraine interview. "It's absolutely wonderful to have you here," Lorraine began, her voice carrying that familiar lilt that had endeared her to millions of viewers over the years. "You look absolutely stunning, and I have to say, the audience is thrilled to see you back on British television." The compliment seemed genuine enough, but there was something in Lorraine's tone, a slight edge that suggested this interview might not follow the usual script of gentle questions and predictable answers. Meghan's response was equally polished, thanking Lorraine for the invitation and expressing how exciting it was to be back in the UK, though her body language suggested otherwise. Her smile seemed a fraction too wide, her laugh a beat too quick, and those who knew how to read between the lines of celebrity appearances might have noticed the way her hands gripped the armrests of her chair just a little too tightly. The first few minutes proceeded according to plan. Lorraine asked about Meghan's recent projects, her life in California, and how she was settling into her new ventures outside of royal life. Meghan delivered her answers with the same rehearsed charm she had perfected during her acting days, speaking about exciting opportunities and meaningful work with the kind of vague enthusiasm that fills airtime without actually saying anything substantial. But then Lorraine began to probe a little deeper, and that's when the carefully maintained facade began to show its first cracks. "I'm curious," Lorraine said, leaning forward slightly in her chair, "about your relationship with the British press. You've been quite vocal about your experiences, and I wonder if you think there's been any progress in how the media covers public figures, particularly women of color." It was a reasonable question, the kind that any experienced interviewer might ask, but something in Meghan's expression shifted. Her smile became more fixed, more deliberate, and when she spoke, there was a new tension in her voice. "Well, Lorraine, I think that's a rather loaded question, isn't it? I mean, we could spend hours discussing the systematic issues with British media, but I'm not sure that's what your viewers tuned in to hear this morning." The response caught Lorraine off guard. In her decades of broadcasting, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate tricky conversations. But there was something in Meghan's tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a typical celebrity deflection. This felt more like a challenge, a line drawn in the sand before the real battle had even begun. "I don't think it's loaded at all," Lorraine replied, her own voice maintaining its professional warmth while carrying just a hint of steel. I think it's a fair question about something you've spoken about quite publicly. Our viewers are intelligent people who can handle a thoughtful discussion about important issues. Meghan's laugh in response was anything but amused. It was sharp, almost incredulous, and it seemed to hang in the air between them like a warning shot. Thoughtful discussion? Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels more like you're trying to relitigate issues that I've already addressed extensively. I came here to talk about my work, my future projects, not to rehash old grievances for the entertainment of your audience. The studio fell unnaturally quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something was shifting, that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would be replayed and analyzed for weeks to come. Lorraine's expression remained pleasant, but those who knew her well could see the subtle tightening around her eyes, the way her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry if you feel that way," Lorraine said, her Scottish accent becoming slightly more pronounced as it often did when she was feeling defensive. "But I think our viewers would disagree. They're interested in honest conversations with public figures, not just promotional material for upcoming projects. That's what sets this show apart from other programs." The word promotional hit Meghan like a slap. Her composure, which had been carefully maintained throughout her public life, began to show serious stress fractures. When she spoke again, her voice carried a coldness that seemed to drop the temperature in the studio by several degrees. "Promotional material? Is that what you think this is? I came here as a courtesy, Lorraine, because I was told this would be a friendly conversation. I didn't realize I was walking into an ambush designed to generate headlines at my expense." Her American accent seemed to become more pronounced, as if she was unconsciously distancing herself from her surroundings. The audience in the studio began to murmur among themselves, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the polite, controlled disagreement that sometimes occurred on talk shows. This felt raw, personal, and completely unscripted. Lorraine, to her credit, maintained her professional composure, but there was no hiding the fact that this interview had veered completely off course. "I'm certainly not ambushing anyone," she said firmly. "I'm doing my job as a journalist, which sometimes means asking questions that guests might find uncomfortable. That's not personal. That's professional." But Meghan was having none of it. Her mask of media-trained politeness was slipping away entirely, revealing something much more volatile underneath. "Professional? You want to talk about professional? Let's talk about the professional responsibility that comes with having a platform like this. Let's talk about the professional ethics of using someone's appearance on your show to create drama where none needs to exist." The confrontation was escalating with each exchange, and everyone in the studio could feel it. The production team was frantically trying to figure out how to handle a situation that was spiraling beyond their control, while Lorraine found herself in the unprecedented position of having a guest essentially lecture her about journalism on her own show. What happened next would set the stage for an even more explosive confrontation, as two strong-willed women with very different perspectives on media, responsibility, and respect prepared to engage in a battle that neither would walk away from unchanged. The tension in the studio was palpable, as Lorraine took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain control of her own show. But Meghan wasn't finished. She leaned forward in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the armrest in a rhythm that seemed to match the increasing pace of her heartbeat. The casual elegance she had walked in with was rapidly being replaced by something far more combative. "You know what, Lorraine? I think we need to address the elephant in the room here," Meghan said, her voice taking on a tone that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "Because this isn't really about journalism, is it? This is about ratings. This is about creating a moment that will go viral, that will get people talking, that will boost your numbers. And you're willing to use me as your sacrificial lamb to make that happen." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Lorraine's face flushed slightly, a telltale sign that Meghan had struck a nerve. For 30 years, Lorraine Kelly had built her reputation on being the safe harbor of daytime television, the host who made everyone feel welcome and comfortable. To have that integrity questioned so publicly and so bluntly was clearly hitting harder than she was prepared for. That is absolutely not true, Lorraine responded, her voice rising slightly above its usual measured tone. I have never, in 3 decades of broadcasting, used a guest for ratings. My show succeeds because people trust me to have genuine conversations, not manufactured drama. If you're uncomfortable with basic questions about your public statements, then perhaps you should reconsider doing interviews altogether. The suggestion that Meghan should avoid interviews altogether was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Meghan's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and when she spoke again, her words came out clipped and precise, each one delivered like a carefully aimed arrow. Basic questions? Is that what you're calling this interrogation? Let me tell you something about basic questions, Lorraine. Basic questions don't come loaded with 3 years of tabloid narratives. Basic questions don't assume guilt before innocence. And basic questions certainly don't trap guests into defending themselves against allegations they never made. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what felt like a killing blow. But then again, I suppose when you've spent your career asking celebrities about their breakfast preferences and holiday plans, actual journalism might feel foreign to you. The insult was so unexpected, so personal, and so cutting that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Lorraine's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then something much harder and more determined. The audience gasped audibly, and several crew members exchanged worried glances. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television, and into the realm of genuine hostility. Lorraine set down her cue cards with deliberate precision, her movements controlled but clearly furious. When she looked back up at Meghan, her expression had transformed completely. Gone was the warm, nurturing television personality that millions knew and loved. In her place sat a woman who had been publicly humiliated on her own show and wasn't about to take it lying down. I'm going to give you one opportunity to take that back, Lorraine said, her Scottish accent now thick with barely contained anger. Because I have been in this industry since before you were old enough to understand what journalism meant. I have interviewed prime ministers, celebrities, and royalty, and I have always conducted myself with professionalism and respect. I will not sit here and let someone who walked away from their responsibilities lecture me about my career. The reference to walking away from responsibilities was a direct hit at Meghan's departure from royal duties, and everyone in the studio knew it. Meghan's face went pale, then flushed red, and for a moment it looked like she might actually get up and leave right then and there. But instead, she did something far more dangerous. She doubled down. Walked away from my responsibilities? Meghan's voice was now shaking with rage. Is that how you see it? A woman protecting her family from institutional racism and media harassment was walking away from her responsibilities? That's rich. Coming from someone who built her career on being the acceptable face of British media, never too challenging, never too difficult, always ready with a smile and a safe question that won't ruffle any feathers. She stood up suddenly, towering over Lorraine, who remained seated, and pointed an accusatory finger at the host. You want to talk about responsibility, Lorraine? Let's talk about your responsibility to challenge the system that drove me out of this country. Let's talk about your responsibility to call out the racism and misogyny that masqueraded as journalism. But no, that would require actual courage, wouldn't it? It's much easier to sit here in your comfortable studio and take potshots at people who had the backbone to fight back. The studio was in complete chaos now. Producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented meltdown continue. The audience was divided between those who were clearly uncomfortable with the hostility and others who seemed transfixed by the raw drama unfolding before them. Lorraine slowly stood up, matching Meghan's aggressive posture. At 64 years old, she was not about to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of their titles or status. You want to talk about courage? Let me tell you about courage. Courage is staying and fighting, not running away to California and throwing stones from across the pond. Courage is facing criticism without playing the victim card every time someone asks you a difficult question. The words "playing the victim card" seemed to be the final straw for Meghan. Her composure, which had been hanging by a thread throughout this exchange, finally snapped completely. "Victim card?" she repeated, her voice rising to a level that made everyone in the studio wince. "I am not playing anything, Lorraine. I am a victim. I was victimized by your press, by your institutions, and apparently by people like you who are too comfortable with the status quo to acknowledge that there might be something fundamentally wrong with how things work around here." She began pacing now, her elegant exterior completely abandoned in favor of raw, unfiltered emotion. "You sit there in your cozy studio, protected by your decades of being the safe choice, the non-threatening choice, and you have the audacity to judge me for making the hard decisions that you never had to make. Well, let me tell you something. I don't need your approval, I don't need your platform, and I certainly don't need to sit here and listen to thinly veiled attacks disguised as journalism." Lorraine watched this display with growing disgust. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice cutting through Meghan's emotional outburst like a knife. "Everything is about you, isn't it? Your pain, your struggles, your victimization. What about the institution you married into? What about the family you left behind? What about the responsibilities that came with the privileges you were so happy to accept until they became inconvenient?" The mention of family clearly struck home, because Meghan stopped pacing and turned to face Lorraine with an expression of pure fury. "Family? You want to talk about family? The family that stood by and watched while I was torn apart in your newspapers? The family that chose their precious institution over protecting someone who was supposed to be one of their own? That family?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. It was a bitter, harsh sound that seemed to echo off the studio walls. "You know what your problem is, Lorraine. You're part of the machine. You've been part of it for so long that you can't even see how toxic it is. You think asking hard questions makes you a journalist, but really you're just another cog in a system designed to tear down anyone who doesn't fit the mold." The personal nature of the attacks was clearly taking its toll on Lorraine, but she wasn't backing down. If anything, Meghan's emotional breakdown seemed to be strengthening her resolve. "The only toxic thing I see here is someone who can't take responsibility for their own choices," she shot back. "You made decisions, Meghan. You chose to leave, you chose to speak out publicly, you chose to make those accusations. Own them. Don't blame everyone else, because the consequences weren't what you expected." This exchange had moved far beyond anything anyone in the studio had ever witnessed before. What had started as a celebrity interview had devolved into something that felt more like a public therapy session gone wrong, with two women airing grievances that went far deeper than anything that should have been discussed on morning television. The confrontation was reaching a fever pitch, and everyone could sense that something even more explosive was about to happen. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Meghan, her face flushed with rage and her carefully constructed public persona completely shattered, took a step closer to Lorraine's desk. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer the polished American accent that had charmed millions during her acting days, or the refined tones she had adopted as a member of the royal family. This was something primal, raw, and utterly unfiltered. "You want to know what's really toxic, Lorraine? It's people like you who pretend to be allies while stabbing people in the back. You sit there with your fake smile and your condescending questions, and you think you're so much better than the tabloid journalists who at least have the honesty to admit they're trying to destroy people. At least they don't hide behind this facade of respectability." She gestured wildly around the studio, her movements becoming increasingly erratic. "This whole setup, this cozy little morning show where you play the nation's sweetheart while doing the establishment's dirty work, it's disgusting. You're worse than the obvious enemies, because people trust you. They invite you into their homes every morning thinking you're on their side, but you're not. You're just another part of the machine that grinds people up and spits them out for entertainment." Lorraine had heard enough. She stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward from the force of her movement, and slammed her hand down on the desk between them. The sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot, and several audience members actually jumped in their seats. "That is enough." Lorraine's voice boomed with an authority that seemed to surprise even herself. "I have sat here and listened to you attack my integrity, my career, and my character, and I am done being your verbal punching bag. You want to talk about machines? Let's talk about the machine that turned you into whatever this is, this entitled, self-pitying person who thinks the whole world owes them something. She moved around her desk, closing the distance between herself and Meghan, her small frame somehow seeming larger and more imposing than it had any right to. You married into the most privileged family in the world. You were given a platform that billions of people could only dream of, and instead of using it to make a positive difference, you used it to settle personal scores and air private grievances in the most public way possible. Meghan's eyes widened, clearly not expecting Lorraine to go on the offensive so aggressively. "How dare you?" she began, but Lorraine cut her off with a wave of her hand. "No, I'm talking now. You've had your say. Now it's my turn." Lorraine's Scottish accent was so thick now that she almost seemed like a different person entirely. "You talk about responsibility and courage and fighting back, but what you did wasn't brave. It was selfish. You burned bridges. You hurt people who cared about you. And then you ran away when things got difficult. And now you have the audacity to come back here and lecture me about journalism." The personal nature of the attack seemed to break something in Meghan. She began shaking, whether from anger or hurt or both, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what I went through, what they put me through. The threats, the lies, the constant harassment." "Oh, spare me the sob story," Lorraine interrupted, her patience completely exhausted. "Every public figure deals with criticism and negative press. The difference is that most of them handle it with dignity, instead of throwing tantrums and playing the martyr. You want sympathy? You want understanding? Then stop treating everyone around you like they're your personal enemies, and start taking some responsibility for your own actions." The studio had fallen completely silent, except for the sound of both women's heavy breathing. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented breakdown, while the production team stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this catastrophe continue to unfold. Meghan stared at Lorraine for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet, but every word carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what, Lorraine? You're right about one thing. I don't need this. I don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who sold their soul to the establishment so long ago that they can't even remember what independent thought feels like." She reached down and grabbed her purse from beside her chair, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I came here thinking I might have misjudged British media, thinking maybe there were still some decent people in this industry who could have an honest conversation without hidden agendas, but I was wrong. You're all the same, small-minded, bitter people who tear others down to make yourselves feel important." She slung her purse over her shoulder and turned toward the studio exit, but Lorraine wasn't finished with her yet. "Running away again?" she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How very predictable. When things get tough, when someone finally calls you out on your behavior, you just leave. No wonder your royal experiment didn't work out." Meghan stopped dead in her tracks. For a moment, it looked like she might turn around and continue the fight, but instead, she did something that was somehow even more devastating. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound that seemed to drain all the warmth from the room. "My royal experiment?" she repeated, still facing away from Lorraine. "Is that what you think it was? An experiment? Let me tell you something about experiments, Lorraine. Sometimes you discover that the thing you're testing is so fundamentally broken that the only rational response is to walk away." She turned around one final time, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to encompass not just Lorraine, but everything she represented. "I didn't fail at being royal. The institution failed at being human. And you're just another symptom of that failure." With those words hanging in the air like a curse, Meghan Markle walked toward the studio exit with as much dignity as she could muster. But she wasn't quite finished yet. At the door, she paused and looked back at the cameras, addressing not Lorraine but the viewing audience directly. To anyone watching this who has ever felt like they didn't belong, like they were fighting a system designed to break them down, know that walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. And to those of you who think this kind of treatment is acceptable, who think that tearing people apart for your entertainment is just harmless fun, take a good long look in the mirror. She pointed directly at Lorraine, who was still standing behind her desk, breathing heavily and looking slightly stunned by the entire exchange. This is what your national treasure really looks like when she thinks no one important is watching. Remember that the next time she's telling you how much she cares about her guests and her viewers. And with that final devastating blow, Meghan Markle walked out of the studio, leaving behind a silence so complete that it seemed to press down on everyone present like a physical weight. The cameras continued to roll for several more seconds, capturing Lorraine's shell-shocked expression and the stunned faces of the studio audience, before someone finally had the presence of mind to cut to commercial. Lorraine remained standing behind her desk for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty doorway where her guest had disappeared. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a mixture of emotions that she wasn't quite prepared to process. Part of her felt vindicated. She had stood her ground against someone who had attacked her personally and professionally. But another part of her was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had just happened, and what it might mean for her career and reputation. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many of them still processing what they had witnessed. This wasn't the polite disagreement or minor celebrity meltdown that occasionally happened on talk shows. This was something far more raw and personal, a complete breakdown of the usual boundaries that separated public personas from private feelings. As the commercial break continued, Lorraine finally sat back down in her chair, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her cue cards and tried to compose herself for whatever came next. She had been in television for 3 decades, had weathered countless controversies and difficult interviews, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of what had just occurred. The confrontation between Lorraine Kelly and Meghan Markle was over, but its impact was only just beginning. In the space of less than 30 minutes, 2 women had torn apart their carefully constructed public images and revealed something much more human and complicated underneath. The cameras had captured every moment, every cutting remark, and emotional outburst, ensuring that this explosive encounter would be analyzed, debated, and remembered long after both women had moved on to other chapters in their lives. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had become something unprecedented in the history of daytime television, a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the real cost of fame, privilege, and the impossible expectations placed on public figures in the modern media landscape.